welcome to this video in which I'm basically just going to be explaining my CPSC 1 and 3 projects. I'm just going to get straight into it, so I've got a lot to say. I'm just going to be answering the questions from the Canvas module for the project now. So to give an overview of my project, essentially my project concerns air pollution data, which was recorded over the course of a couple of years at Vancouver International Airport. And what I'm trying to do is realize any discernible pattern between the level of different types of air pollution versus predictable periods of mass travel, so essentially holidays. I thought it would be interesting to see if there's any reflection of human travel in the levels of air pollution at somewhere like an airport. And I thought this was interesting because I love to travel. I've been to YVR many times, and I was just interested to see this. So this information was published by OpenAQ. They're a non-profit organization whose website releases different maps of air pollution readings over time. They have data over time that they record, and so I've used a CSV file that they released. So to explain what I used about what I learned in systematic program design to solve the problem, the design choices that I made basically. So with my data specifically, the only real flaw that I noticed, I'll start with the flaws that I noticed. The only real flaw that I noticed was the fact that the data concerning the local time didn't discern between Pacific Standard Time and Pacific Daylight Time. Basically meaning that we have a 1 hour discrepancy in half of our data, assuming that we don't manually perform some kind of computation to convert between the different time definitions. I decided just to circumvent the problem, and so in response to that, I opted to just use the UTC time, which even though it offsets our time away from the local time zone, it allows us to eliminate a very simple but resource taxing computation from the project. So in designing this project, I had to be very conscious with the way that I dealt with my data types, because I dealt with data that typically needs to be grouped specifically for analysis. By this I mean that it didn't have any I didn't have any simple lists of just simple integers or strings that I had to deal with, but rather, for instance, like time data, in which that includes month, day, sometimes year, and all of it just kind of needs to be held together into a single package. I chose to create an actual compound data type, which allowed me to keep all of my dates together while allowing me to easily perform some calculations that concern only the month or only the day. So these design choices were made such that I had the most flexibility in my data that I could work with in different circumstances. So because I had a number of initial thoughts, which I read about up here, I tried to keep my data definitions such that they could be applied to the biggest number of contexts as possible. So for instance, with some of my computation that I ended up doing, it might have actually been significantly easier to have just defined days out of the year by a single integer. So for like 1 being the first day of the year and 365 being the last, but this would have eliminated the possibilities of, say, grouping by month, which I didn't actually end up doing in my data definitions or any of my programming, but it could have potentially been an interesting place for further exploration, and I can potentially talk about that a bit more after. In response to my project concept specifically though, I've currently created a number of graphs of the average air pollution levels by type over different holiday dates at Vancouver Airport, as well as over just generic dates throughout the year. I include a couple of those down here just as kind of a control variable. Dates that I just kind of qualitatively decided don't have much widespread importance within Vancouver specifically. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the trends that I noticed, some of them that I expected, some of them that I didn't necessarily. So I performed a couple of calculations that calculate the averages just over the entire data set. So we can see that the average for the PM2.5 levels is 5.6, and the average ozone level is roughly 0.02. And so that gives us a bit of a metric to evaluate how the different dates affect the air pollution levels. So a couple of things that I noticed are for instance, dates near major holidays, but not the major holidays themselves, typically have much higher air pollution levels, at least for the PM2.5s. For instance, I'll list out the example of Christmas. So on Christmas, typically on Christmas, obviously families, they spend time together. Christmas is typically not the day specifically that people want to be traveling. They would usually want to be traveling someday near Christmas. For instance, the day before Christmas, which actually in this data set specifically, which is a very small subset of our overall data set, but is a graph of some of the major days throughout the year. December 24th actually had the highest air pollution level in Vancouver, which makes sense because Christmas is it's probably the most prominent holiday within Canada, and so it makes sense that the days around Christmas would correspond to higher pollution levels, because December 24th people are probably coming home to see family. December 26th, or Boxing Day, is when a number of people will probably be leaving, and so on Christmas it's lower, which makes perfect sense. New Year's Eve is the lowest of the list, which makes perfect sense because New Year's Eve and New Year's Day, typically if people are going to be traveling throughout the holiday season, typically business people, they would come home for Christmas and then maybe go off somewhere else for New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, but just people, regular families that are spending time together, they would typically probably just be stagnant throughout the entire time period. So from Christmas to New Year's Eve, it would make sense, I think, for New Year's Eve and New Year's Day to be the lowest of the bunch. Another thing that I noticed among these dates specifically was that December 23rd and December 27th were actually relatively close to just the average amount of air pollution for the PM2.5s. Again, we're on the PM2.5 graph. They were fairly average, it seems. So the majority of travel, it seemed there was a bit of a travel spike here and here. Obviously subject within whatever error we actually have within this graph, which would require a bit more rigorous computation in order to actually determine. Valentine's Day also has a bit of a spike in air pollution, which would make sense because couples going to travel for Valentine's Day, I could see that being a feasible reason for travel to exist. Now, one thing that I had hypothesized about when I was first writing about this project, that I wrote about all the way up here, was I thought it would be interesting to chart PM2.5 pollution versus ozone pollution, which I haven't actually done, but we can kind of qualitatively see a bit of a trend between the two. So as PM2.5 levels increase, you'll see that ozone levels actually decrease, it would seem. Why exactly this is, I'm not entirely clear. But I would suspect it has something to do with kind of the chemical processes that govern these different PM2.5 pollution versus ozone pollution, the different types of pollution and how they interact in the environment. I know that ozone is typically a less long-lasting pollution type than PM2.5, and I suspect that PM2.5, the presence of that could potentially have an effect on the ozone level. Though again, this kind of graph could potentially be improved upon by making this more widespread just over the course of the year itself to see if this trend truly persists, or by coding some kind of function that would actually take PM2.5 and compare it to ozone and then calculate the amount of error or the amount of offset between it and how that kind of occurs. So moving on to the dates with little importance to just the public within Vancouver that I deemed were just kind of average days throughout the year. These dates, they all correspond roughly to the average amounts of each pollution type over the data set, which was obviously something that we would have expected to happen. Obviously, every day is going to have different pollution levels. There are also a lot of other factors that could potentially impact the amount of pollution in the area. One thing that I can think of specifically is during warmer months or drier months, during the dry season, wildfires could potentially have a massive impact on the amount of PM2.5 in the environment, which is a very notable pattern and problem within Vancouver, which could potentially have an impact. I tried to do a bit of research to find some of the most prominent wildfire dates, but I couldn't find anything very consistent, and so that again would require us to do a more overarching kind of code a couple of more functions in order to do that, all of which these are all things that we could potentially do in the future for this project. So now to discuss the most difficult parts of this project for me and why. So among the most difficult parts of this project was definitely dealing with the dates themselves from beginning to end. So in the raw CSV file, which I'll go back to, in the raw CSV file, as you can see, the date time, which includes year, month, day, hour, and more, they're all set as single data points. So you'll see up here we have a category for UTC time, we have a category for local time, but what that includes is the year, the month, the day, the time, the minute, the hour, the second, it includes all of it in one single data point. And from this, I had to basically manually separate these values into distinct data points, which I'll go to that right now. So I had to manually parse these data points, which I did right here, by setting the raw data to a string and then manually determining out of which character index within the string the specific values would begin and end, which was definitely one of the most frustrating bits of parsing that I had to engage with because of how specific I had to be in my coding and how long this process was to really get right. I originally had thought about just simply leaving this data as a string, but I'm glad that I dealt with it this way because it made the process much less laborious later on in working with this data than it would have been if I just left it as a string. So again, with dates, I also had to perform some conversion between numerical representations and written representations, which I did right here. And the reason I had to do this is because for the graphical representations of the data, it was much easier just on the eyes just to see an actual date with a written month rather than just a series of numbers or something like this where it says time data and then the year, the month, the day. I essentially realized that the calendar we have is fairly unsuited to be used in a programming context, and it introduces a number of additional considerations that wouldn't exist when working with other metrics. That I could potentially improve upon this project in the future or just add on to it in the future would be in actually coding something that compares PM 2.5 levels over time to ozone levels. I think that could be really interesting, and I could potentially reveal something about the environment and the way that it actually works at a chemical level. And yeah, that's it for this project. Thanks so much for watching.